A boy is standing in a workroom in Savile Row, and his hands are being watched. He is 16 years old, and the jacket in front of him is wool and money and history, and the men around him do not yet know that he is better at this than they are, but they will. The year is 1985. The street outside is old and quiet in the way that expensive streets are quiet, even in London, even in the middle of the day. Inside there is the sound of scissors on fabric, the pull of thread, the particular silence that comes from work that has been done the same way for 200 years. The boy's name is Lee Alexander McQueen, though no one outside his family has ever called him Alexander, and he has come here from Lewisham, from a council estate in the East, from a world that does not dress in the suits made on this street. But his hands know what to do. They have always known. He is cutting a pattern. The jacket will be worn by someone whose name he will never learn, someone whose body will be measured and remeasured until the garment sits as close to the skin as fabric can sit without becoming skin. This is what they do here. This is the craft. A Savile Row suit is an architecture of the body, built from the inside out, canvassed and weighted and shaped, so that when a man moves, the suit moves with him, or perhaps it is the other way around. Lee is learning this architecture the way his ancestors might have learned stone masonry or shipbuilding. Piece by piece, seam by seam, there is no rushing it, there is no skipping ahead. The work teaches itself to your hands if you give it time. He was born in 1969, the youngest of 6 children, to a taxi driver and a social studies teacher in a flat that was full of bodies and voices and not enough rooms. His mother, Joyce, was the center of the house. She was a woman of strong opinions and clear affections, and she loved her children with a ferocity that did not require softness to be felt. Lee was close to her in a way that went past words. He could make her laugh. He could also make her furious. He was sensitive and watchful and given to outbursts of temper or tears, and he did not fit easily into the world of boys his age, though he tried. His father, Ronald, drove the cab and came home tired. There was not a lot of money. There was never a lot of money, but there was dinner on the table and a television in the corner, and the sense, however thin, that the family was holding together against the pressures that bore down on working-class families in Thatcher's Britain. Wesham was not picturesque. It was concrete and bus routes and estates that looked like every other estate, the kind of place people left if they could and stayed if they could not. But it was also full of life in the way that crowded places are always full of life. Lee walked to school past shop fronts and construction sites and rows of houses that all looked the same until you learned to see the differences. He was good at seeing differences. He watched people the way other children watched television, the way a woman carried a handbag, the way a man's trousers broke over his shoes, the way someone held themselves when they were trying not to be seen. He was absorbing a language he did not yet have words for. At school, he was restless and uninterested and frequently in trouble. He was bright but not academic. He liked to draw. He drew birds mostly, detailed, obsessive renderings of wings and talons and beaks. He would sit for hours with a pencil and paper, getting the feathers right, getting the shape of a skull beneath the softness. His teachers did not know what to make of him. He did not know what to make of himself. He knew only that he wanted to make things, and that sitting in a classroom learning things that did not interest him felt like a kind of violence. He left school at 16. There was no question of university. There was barely a question of what came next. But his mother had a friend, or a friend of a friend, and that person knew someone on Savile Row. And so Lee was delivered into an apprenticeship at Anderson and Shepherd, one of the oldest and most respected tailoring houses in London. It was not the kind of opportunity that came to boys from Lewisham, and Lee knew it. He took it seriously. He arrived early and stayed late. He watched the older tailors with a focus that bordered on intensity. They showed him how to cut a lapel, how to set a sleeve so that it curved with the natural shape of the shoulder, how to build a jacket from the inside so that the structure was invisible but always felt. He learned fast, faster than they expected. There is a particular pleasure in discovering that you are good at something, not just competent but good, better perhaps than the people teaching you. Lee felt that pleasure, and it filled something in him that had been empty. His hands understood the language of fabric. They understood tension and drape, and the way a single stitch could change the line of a garment. He was not patient by nature, but he learned patience here, because the work demanded it. A Savile Row suit could not be rushed. It had to be made correctly or not at all. And so he slowed down. He learned to think through his hands. After 2 years at Anderson and Shepherd, he moved to Geeves and Hawkes, another house on the row, where he worked on military uniforms and learned about structure and formality, and the way a uniform can make a man believe he is someone else. Then he went to the theatrical costumiers, Angels and Bermans, where he worked on costumes for period films and operas, and learned that clothing could be narrative, that a sleeve or a collar could tell you everything about who a person was or wanted to be. He was 17, 18, 19. He was learning to see clothing not just as craft, but as language. And he was also learning that he was gay, and that this fact would mean different things in different rooms, and that some of those rooms would never be safe. He moved to Italy for a short time and worked for the designer Romeo Gigli, cutting patterns and learning the Italian approach to tailoring, which was softer and more draped than the rigid precision of Savile Row. He moved again to Tokyo and worked for the designer Koji Tatsuno and learned about Japanese construction techniques and the way a garment could reveal the body by suggesting it rather than clinging to it. He was absorbing everything. He was storing it all away, and then he came back to London because London was home and because there was something he wanted to do that he could not yet name but could feel, gathering in him like weather. In 1990, at the age of 21, he applied to Central St. Martin's College of Art and Design to study fashion. He was older than most of the applicants, and he had no formal training in design, only in tailoring. But he had a portfolio of sketches and photographs of garments he had worked on, and he had something else, too. He had conviction. When he sat for the interview, he told them that he did not need them to teach him how to make clothes. He already knew how to make clothes. He needed them to teach him how to think about clothes. They accepted him. Central St. Martin's was a different world. It was loud and colorful and full of people who believed that fashion could be art, that it could be provocation, that it could mean something beyond the transaction of buying and selling. Lee, who had spent years in the quiet discipline of tailoring, found himself surrounded by students who wanted to make clothes that no one would wear, that existed only to be photographed or shown on a runway. He thought some of it was pretentious. He thought some of it was brilliant. He absorbed it all, the way he always did. He was called Lee by his friends and family, but at St. Martin's he began to use his middle name, Alexander. It sounded more serious, more professional. It was a way of signaling that he was not just a boy from Lewisham anymore, though of course he was always a boy from Lewisham. You do not stop being where you came from just because you change your name. His tutors noticed him immediately. He was technically superior to everyone else in the program. He could draft a pattern faster and more accurately than students who had been training for years. But he was also angry, or something that looked like anger. He had a temper. He would argue with his instructors, sometimes violently. He did not suffer fools. He did not suffer criticism that he felt was unearned. He was difficult. He was also undeniably talented, and talent, especially talent that looks like genius, buys you a certain amount of latitude. For his final project, his MA collection, he made a line called Jack the Ripper Stalks His Victims. It was a collection about violence in Victorian London, and the way that violence against women is often aestheticized, turned into story, turned into spectacle. The garments were dark and layered and strange. There were jackets with exaggerated shoulders and trousers cut so low on the hips that they seemed to redefine where the body began and ended. There were fabrics that looked like they had been slashed and repaired. There were references to prostitution and poverty and the way that women's bodies have always been sites of violence and control. The collection was shown in 1992, and it was not like the other graduate collections. It was darker, more confrontational. It did not try to be pretty, it tried to say something. And sitting in the audience was a woman named Isabella Blow. Isabella Blow was a fashion editor and stylist, the kind of person who moved through the fashion world like a piece of performance art herself. She wore hats by Philip Tracy that looked like sculptures. She dressed in a way that suggested she was always on her way to a funeral or a coronation, often both at once. She had an eye for talent and a deep, almost reckless commitment to the designers she believed in. She saw McQueen's collection, and she knew immediately that she was looking at something rare. She bought the entire collection, all of it. She paid for it in installments because she did not have enough money to pay for it all at once. She became his patron, his champion, his friend, and eventually something like family. Isabella introduced McQueen to her world. She brought him to parties and dinners and country houses. She wore his clothes. She talked about him to anyone who would listen. She believed in him with a fervor that bordered on mania, and he needed that belief. He was 23 years old, and he had no money and no connections, and he was trying to start a career in an industry that did not tend to reward working-class boys with difficult personalities and dark visions. He set up a studio in a warehouse in Hoxton, which at the time was not the gentrified neighborhood it would become, but a scrappy industrial part of East London. He worked with a small team, sometimes just himself and a few assistants. He made collections on almost no budget. He scavenged fabrics and borrowed money and worked through the night. His shows were held in strange places, warehouses, car parks, abandoned buildings. They were not polite. They were not easy to watch. They were confrontational and theatrical and full of imagery that disturbed as much as it seduced. His second collection, in 1993, was called Nihilism. The models walked through water. The clothes were deconstructed, unraveling, barely holding together. It felt like a collection about collapse, about things falling apart. His third collection, Taxi Driver, was inspired by the Martin Scorsese film and the idea of urban decay and violence and alienation. The clothes were sharp and hard-edged, with a military precision softened by strange, almost Baroque details. In 1995, he showed a collection called Highland Rape. The title alone was provocative, and McQueen intended it to be. The collection was about the English persecution of the Scottish Highlands, the clearances and the violence and the erasure of a culture. But it was also, inevitably, about rape. The models walked in torn lace and shredded fabrics, their bodies exposed in ways that looked violent rather than sensual. Some critics accused him of misogyny, of exploiting images of brutalized women for shock value. Others argue that he was making a point about how women's bodies are used and violated, that the discomfort was the point. McQueen himself was furious at the accusations. He said the collection was about his heritage, about Scotland, about history. He said people were reading it wrong, but the images were what they were, and images speak louder than intentions. This was the tension that would follow him for the rest of his career. He made clothes that were about power and vulnerability, about beauty and violence, about the female body as a site of both strength and suffering. And depending on where you stood, depending on who you were, those clothes could look like empowerment or exploitation, like art or provocation or cruelty. McQueen did not make it easy to decide. He did not want it to be easy. But the clothes themselves, the actual garments, were extraordinary. If you looked past the provocation or through it, you saw craft of the highest order. The tailoring was impeccable. The construction was innovative. He was doing things with fabric and structure that other designers were not attempting. He combined the rigid discipline of Savile Row with the wild imagination of a St. Martin's graduate, and the result was clothing that felt both ancient and futuristic, both grounded in tradition and utterly new. In 1996, he was appointed head designer at Givenchy, the French fashion house founded by Hubert de Givenchy and associated with elegance and restraint, and the image of Audrey Hepburn in a little black dress. McQueen was 27 years old. He had been making clothes professionally for less than 5 years. He was not elegant. He was not restrained. He was a working-class boy from East London with a reputation for making dark, difficult clothes about violence and sex and history. The appointment made no sense, and that was partly why it made headlines. McQueen hated it. He hated Paris, or at least he hated the version of Paris that haute couture represented. He hated the clients, whom he called boring and conservative. He hated the pressure to make clothes that were commercial and wearable and safe. He did not want to make safe clothes. He lasted at Givenchy for 5 years, from 1996 to 2001, and the collections he made there were often brilliant, but also clearly constrained. You could see him chafing against the expectations, trying to smuggle his own vision into a house that wanted something softer, something easier to sell. But the experience was not wasted. It gave him resources. It gave him access to the best ateliers in Paris, to craftspeople who could execute ideas that would have been impossible in his Hoxton studio. It taught him about the business of fashion, about how to manage a team, about how to work within constraints even when you hated them. And it gave him visibility. He was now Alexander McQueen, designer for Givenchy, and that name meant something even to people who did not follow fashion. While he was at Givenchy, he continued to show his own collections in London. These were the collections that mattered to him, where he could do what he wanted without answering to a board or a corporate owner. In 1998, he showed a collection called Joan, inspired by Joan of Arc, with models walking through flames and wearing armor-like garments made of leather and metal. The show ended with a model standing inside a ring of fire, her dress catching the light, and it was both terrifying and transcendent. In 1999, he showed No. 13, a collection that ended with a model standing on a turntable while 2 robotic arms sprayed her with paint. The image was strange and unsettling. The model, Shalom Harlow, stood still in a white dress as the robot circled her, covering her in black and yellow paint, and the dress went from pristine to destroyed in a matter of minutes. It was a performance about control and loss of control, about the body as canvas, about beauty and its destruction. It was also a technical marvel, the kind of thing that could only happen if you had the resources and the vision and the willingness to risk complete failure in front of an audience. This was what McQueen's shows were becoming. They were not just fashion shows, they were events. They were theater. They required sets and lighting and choreography. They cost enormous amounts of money, more than most designers could justify, and they generated press and controversy and a kind of attention that was both good and bad for business. People came to a McQueen show not just to see clothes, but to see what he would do, what image he would create, what boundary he would cross. In 2000, he showed a collection called Eshu, inspired by West African spirituality and the Yoruba deity of chaos and transformation. The runway was an enormous glass box filled with water, and the models walked through it, their reflections doubling them, the clothes moving strangely in the distorted space. In 2001, he showed Voss, a collection that took place inside a mirrored box so that the audience spent the first part of the show looking at their own reflections, waiting until the lights came up inside the box and revealed a padded cell and a naked woman wearing a gas mask surrounded by moths. It was disturbing and beautiful, and it made people angry, and it made people weep, and it was exactly what McQueen wanted. He left Givenchy in 2001. The relationship had been deteriorating for years, and when his contract was up, he did not renew it. He was free, but freedom is expensive, and McQueen needed money to keep making the kind of shows he wanted to make. In 2000, the Gucci Group, which was then the dominant force in luxury fashion, bought 51% of the Alexander McQueen brand. It was a deal that gave McQueen financial stability and creative control. He could keep making his shows, keep making his clothes, without having to answer to a corporate board in the way he had at Givenchy. It was the best compromise he was going to get. The early 2000s were McQueen's peak years, the period when he was most visible, most celebrated, most himself. He was making 2 collections a year for his own label, plus collaborations and one-off projects. He was dressing celebrities and appearing in magazines and being talked about as one of the most important designers in the world. He was also drinking heavily and using drugs and sleeping very little and driving himself with a relentlessness that worried the people around him. He was never satisfied, he was never done. There was always another collection, another show, another image he had to create. In 2003, he showed Ray, a collection inspired by the Amazon and indigenous cultures, with models walking through a set that looked like a jungle, wearing clothes that combined couture techniques with references to tribal dress and body modification. In 2004, he showed Deliverance, a collection about shipwrecks and survival, with models walking in garments that looked like they had been salvaged from the ocean, encrusted with shells and barnacles. The craftsmanship was astonishing garments that looked organic and almost alive, built with techniques that combined traditional tailoring with sculptural and decorative arts. And then, in 2006, he showed The Widows of Culloden. The collection was named for the Battle of Culloden, the final battle of the Jacobite Rising in 1746, when the British Army crushed the Scottish Highland clans and effectively ended the old Highland way of life. McQueen's ancestors were Highlanders, and he had always felt a deep connection to Scotland, to the landscape and the history and the sense of a culture that had been suppressed and nearly erased. The Widows of Culloden was his meditation on that loss. The show took place in a circular space with a pyramid of light in the center. The clothes were a mixture of tartans and lace, sharp tailoring and flowing gowns, military precision and romantic excess. There were references to Scottish dress and Victorian mourning and medieval armor. The models walked slowly, almost processionally, and the atmosphere was somber and elegiac. It felt like a funeral and a fashion show and a history lesson and a work of art all at once. The final look was a gown made of layers and layers of tulle, shaped into a silhouette that was both voluminous and severe, with a bodice that looked like it had been carved from bone. The model who wore it seemed to float, the dress moving around her like mist. It was a garment about grief and memory and the weight of history, and it was one of the most beautiful things McQueen ever made. The Widows of Culloden was a turning point in how people thought about McQueen. It was still theatrical, still grand, but it was also quieter, more introspective. It suggested that McQueen was not just interested in shock and spectacle, but in something deeper in history and identity and the stories that clothing can tell about who we are and where we come from. It was a mature work, the kind of collection that suggested he was entering a new phase, that the wild provocations of his early years were giving way to something more considered. But McQueen was not entering a new phase. He was beginning to fall apart. He had always struggled with his mental health. He had periods of depression, periods of wild energy and creativity followed by crashes. He had been open about this with the people close to him, though not with the public. But as the years went on, the lows got lower and the highs got more desperate. He was drinking more. He was isolated despite being surrounded by people. His shows were more elaborate and more expensive, and the pressure to keep producing, to keep innovating, to keep being Alexander McQueen was crushing him. His personal life was turbulent. He had relationships, some of them serious, but none of them seemed to give him the stability he needed. He was close to his mother, Joyce, closer than to almost anyone else, and when she was diagnosed with cancer, it devastated him. He kept working. He kept making collections, but people noticed that he was thinner, more fragile, more erratic. In 2009, he showed The Horn of Plenty, a collection that was part satire, part self-critique. It was about excess and waste and the fashion industry's obsession with newness. The set was a giant trash heap, and the models walked through it wearing exaggerated, almost grotesque versions of haute couture. It was funny and dark and self-aware, and it also felt like a cry for help. And then in 2010, he showed Plato's Atlantis. The collection was inspired by the idea of evolution and devolution, the theory that as the polar ice caps melted and sea levels rose, humanity might be forced to return to the ocean. The prints on the fabrics were digital and reptilian, based on images of snake and lizard skin, rendered in bright, almost hallucinogenic colors. The silhouettes were sharp and alien, with exaggerated hips and shoulders that made the models look like they belonged to a different species. The shoes were sculptural and strange, built on heels that curved and tapered like something grown rather than made. The show was held in Paris in October of 2009, and it was the first major fashion show to be live-streamed on the internet. The technology was still new, still experimental, and McQueen was fascinated by the possibilities. Cameras descended from the ceiling, moving around the models as they walked, and the feed was broadcast to viewers around the world. It was a statement about the future of fashion, about accessibility and spectacle and the way that digital media was changing everything. The soundtrack was a song by Lady Gaga, Bad Romance, which had not yet been officially released. The collaboration was a coup, a merging of two artists who were both operating at the edge of their respective fields. The show was a triumph. The reviews were ecstatic. People said it was one of McQueen's best collections, a perfect synthesis of craft and concept, of beauty and strangeness. But by the time Plato's Atlantis was shown, McQueen was already in a very dark place. His mother's cancer was worsening. He was exhausted. He was using drugs heavily. He was not sleeping. He told friends that he did not know how much longer he could keep going. Joyce McQueen died on February 11, 2010. Her funeral was scheduled for February 12th. On the night of February 10th, Alexander McQueen was at his home in Mayfair. He had been alone most of the day. He had been drinking. He had been thinking about his mother and about his life and about the fact that he did not want to keep living it. He hanged himself in his wardrobe. He was 40 years old. The news broke the next morning, and the fashion world went into shock. It was not entirely unexpected. People who knew him had been worried for years, but it was still devastating. He was too young. He was too talented. He had too much left to do. The tributes poured in from designers and models, and critics and fans. People talked about his genius and his vision, and the way he had changed fashion. They talked about the darkness that had always been there in the work, and the way it had finally consumed him. His funeral was private. His family buried him quietly, away from the cameras and the press. The fashion industry held memorials and tributes. Magazines ran special issues. Galleries began planning exhibitions. In 2011, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York opened Savage Beauty, a retrospective of McQueen's work. It was a massive undertaking occupying multiple galleries, featuring over 100 garments and accessories from across his career. The exhibition was organized thematically rather than chronologically, with rooms dedicated to different obsessions: romanticism, primitivism, naturalism, the Gothic. Each room was designed to evoke the atmosphere of his shows, with dramatic lighting and soundscapes and the kind of theatrical staging that McQueen had always used. The exhibition was extraordinary. Walking through it, you saw the full range of his work, from the early confrontational pieces to the later more refined collections. You saw the tailoring and the craft, the way every garment was constructed with a rigor and precision that was almost fanatical. You saw the imagination, the willingness to take risks, to try things that might fail spectacularly. You saw the darkness too, the preoccupation with death and violence and the body as a site of suffering. but you also saw the beauty. The garments were beautiful. Even the disturbing ones, maybe especially the disturbing ones, were beautiful. Savage Beauty became the most visited exhibition in the Metropolitan Museum's history. People waited in line for hours to see it. It traveled to London in 2015, to the Victoria and Albert Museum, and it broke records there too. The demand was so high that the museum extended its hours and stayed open around the clock for the final weekend. Over 500,000 people saw the exhibition in London. They came to see the clothes, but they also came to pay their respects, to be in the presence of something that McQueen had made, to understand, if they could, what his work had been about. The myth of Alexander McQueen, if you can call it a myth when it is also simply the truth, is the myth of the working-class boy who learned the most aristocratic craft in the world and used it to say things that no one else was saying. It is the myth of the artist who could not be separated from his work, whose vision was so intense and so personal that it burned through him. It is the myth of genius and self-destruction, which is an old myth, maybe the oldest myth we have about artists, and also one that remains true often enough that we keep believing it. But reducing McQueen to that myth does a disservice to the work. Yes, he was self-destructive. Yes, he struggled. Yes, he died too young. But the work he made was not just the product of suffering. It was the product of extraordinary skill and discipline and intelligence. It was the product of years of training and practice and a fanatical attention to detail. It was the product of a vision that was both deeply personal and engaged with history and culture and the world beyond his own experience. The darkness was there, but so was the beauty. So was the craft. He grew up in a council flat in Lewisham, and by the time he was 30, he was one of the most famous designers in the world. He learned to cut a jacket on Savile Row, and he used that knowledge to make garments that looked like they had come from the future or the distant past that seemed to exist outside of time. He made runway shows that were performance art, that used technology and stagecraft and narrative to create experiences that were unlike anything else in fashion. He made clothes that were about power and vulnerability, about the female body as a site of beauty and violence, about history and memory and the stories we tell about ourselves. He was not easy to love. He was prickly and difficult and often cruel, especially to himself. He pushed people away. He demanded perfection and then despaired when he could not achieve it. He was haunted by his own success, by the pressure to keep producing, to keep being Alexander McQueen. He was also capable of great kindness and loyalty and generosity. The people who loved him deeply. Isabella Blow, who had championed him from the beginning, who had bought his first collection and believed in him when no one else did, struggled with her own mental health for years. She attempted suicide multiple times in the years before her death. In 2007, she drank paraquat, a weed killer, and died slowly and painfully. McQueen was devastated. He had distanced himself from her in the years before her death. They had argued about money and credit and the way the fashion industry had used her and discarded her, and he felt guilty that he had not been there for her at the end. Her death haunted him. It was one more loss in a life that had come to feel like it was made of losses. After McQueen's death, his brand continued. Sarah Burton, who had worked with him for years, became the creative director. She had been his right hand, the person who understood his techniques and his vision, and she took the brand in a direction that was both respectful of his legacy and distinctly her own. She made the wedding dress for Catherine Middleton when she married Prince William in 2011, a gown that was traditional and elegant and beautifully made, exactly the kind of garment that McQueen himself might have scorned as too safe, too commercial. But it was also a garment that demonstrated the technical mastery that McQueen had built into his brand, and it introduced his work to millions of people who had never seen a runway show or visited a museum exhibition. Burton continued to design for the brand for over a decade, making collections that were often beautiful and always well-crafted, though they lacked the darkness and the danger that had defined McQueen's own work. It was an impossible position. How do you continue the work of an artist who is so singular, whose vision was so tied to his own obsessions and his own pain? Burton did the best she could. She kept the house alive. She kept people employed. She made clothes that people wanted to wear. In 2023, Burton left the brand. Sian McGeer, a designer from Ireland who had worked at J.W. Anderson, was appointed as her successor. The brand continues. It will likely continue for as long as there is money to be made from the name Alexander McQueen. But the work that matters, the work that will last, is the work that McQueen himself made. The collections from 1992 to 2010, the garments that are now in museums and private collections, the images that are still being reproduced and referenced and argued about. What does it mean to make fashion that is also art? It is a question that has been debated for as long as fashion has existed. McQueen did not invent the question, but he gave one possible answer. He made garments that were functional, they could be worn, they were cut and constructed to fit a human body, but they were also expressive in a way that went beyond functionality. They said something. They created a mood, an atmosphere, a narrative. They were objects that demanded to be looked at, thought about, felt. He was influenced by everything. By Savile Row tailoring and Japanese construction and Victorian morning dress and African textiles and the films of Stanley Kubrick and the paintings of Francis Bacon and the history of Scotland and the anatomy of birds. He took all of these influences and synthesized them into something that was his own. You could see the references if you knew what to look for, but the work did not feel derivative. It felt original. It felt necessary. There's a photograph from one of his early shows, maybe 1994 or 1995. The model is walking toward the camera, her face stark and pale, her eyes ringed with dark makeup. She is wearing a jacket that is sharp and tailored and slightly too big, the shoulders exaggerated, the lapels cut wide. The fabric looks heavy, like it has weight and history. She looks fierce and fragile at the same time. She looks like she is about to fall apart or about to conquer the world, and you cannot tell which. That is McQueen's work in a single image. That is what he did. He was obsessed with death. Not in a morbid way, or not only in a morbid way, but in the way that artists are often obsessed with death as a limit, as a fact, as the thing that gives life its shape and urgency. He used skulls in his designs, over and over. Skulls printed on scarves and carved into jewelry and embroidered onto jackets. He used bones and skeletons and references to decay and decomposition. He was interested in the body as a structure, as something that could be broken down and rebuilt, as something that was always in the process of becoming something else. He was also obsessed with nature, with the way that nature is both beautiful and violent, that it creates and destroys with the same indifference. He used feathers and shells and horns and antlers in his work. He referenced birds and reptiles and insects. He made garments that looked like they had been grown rather than sewn, that seemed to belong to the natural world as much as to the human world. Plato's Atlantis was the culmination of this obsession, a collection that imagined humanity transforming, returning to the sea, becoming something other than human, and he was obsessed with women. We're not women exactly, but the idea of the female body, the way it is looked at and controlled and idealized and violated. His work was full of images of powerful women and brutalized women, of women as warriors and women as victims. He made corsets and armor and garments that exaggerated the curves of the body or flattened them, that revealed and concealed, that made the body into a spectacle. He said he wanted to empower women. He said he wanted to make them feel strong. But the images he created were often disturbing, and they raised questions that he did not always answer. Was he empowering women or exploiting them? Was he revealing the violence done to women or perpetuating it? The answer is probably both or neither, or it depends on the garment and the context and who is looking. McQueen did not make work that was easy to pin down. He had a particular genius for tailoring. Even in his most theatrical, most conceptual collections, the tailoring was always impeccable. The seams were where they should be. The proportions were balanced. The garments fit the body in a way that showed he understood structure and anatomy and the way fabric moves. This is what distinguished him from other designers who were interested in spectacle. His spectacle was always built on a foundation of craft. The wild images and the provocative themes would not have worked if the clothes themselves had not been so well made. The bumpster trousers, which he introduced in his early collections, are a good example. They were cut so low on the hips that they exposed the top of the buttocks, the base of the spine, the curve where the back meets the hips. It was a shocking silhouette, and it was widely copied, usually badly. But McQueen's version was not just about exposure, it was about proportion. By lowering the waistline, he changed the center of gravity of the body. He made the torso look longer, the legs look different. He created a new line. It was a tailoring innovation disguised as provocation, or the armadillo shoes from Plato's Atlantis. They were 12-inch heels that curved and tapered, built on a sculpted platform that looked organic, almost alien. They were not shoes that anyone would wear in daily life. They were barely shoes that anyone could walk in. But they were also technical marvels, built with a precision and a sculptural sensibility that showed McQueen's training and his imagination working together. They were functional objects that were also works of art. He worked with collaborators who were as obsessed and as skilled as he was. The milliner Philip Treacy made hats for many of his shows, hats that were sculptures, that extended the line of the garment or created a silhouette that was strange and unforgettable. The jeweler Sean Lean made pieces that looked like they had been forged in a medieval workshop, metal corsets and spine necklaces, and pieces that turned the body into armor. The shoe designer Di Reese worked on some of the most extreme footwear, the kinds of shoes that looked impossible to walk in and often were. The makeup artist, Val Garland, and the hairstylist Guido Palau created looks that were as much a part of the show as the clothes, that contributed to the atmosphere and the narrative. McQueen was a designer, but he was also a director. He staged his shows the way a film director stages a scene. He thought about lighting and sound and movement and the emotional arc of the presentation. He wanted the audience to feel something, not just to admire the clothes. He wanted to create an experience that would stay with them, that would disturb them or move them, or make them think differently about fashion and about the body and about beauty. There is a story, probably apocryphal but repeated often enough that it has become part of the legend, that McQueen once said, "I want to empower women. I want people to be afraid of the women I dress." It is a good line, the kind of line that captures something essential about his work. He did want to make women look powerful, but he also wanted to make them look vulnerable, to show the tension between power and vulnerability, to suggest that the two are not opposites, but are always present together. His shows were often criticized for being misogynistic, for using images of brutalized or objectified women. The Highland Rape Collection is the most famous example, but there were others. In The Overlook, a collection inspired by Stanley Kubrick's film The Shining, models walked in garments that referenced the film's imagery of violence and madness. In Voss, the final image was a naked woman in a gas mask, surrounded by moths, confined in a glass box. These images were difficult to watch. They made people uncomfortable. McQueen did not apologize for them. He said they were about history, about violence, about the way women's bodies are used and abused. He said the discomfort was intentional. It is worth asking whether he succeeded in what he set out to do. Did his work empower women, or did it just aestheticize their suffering? Did it critique the fashion industry's objectification of women, or did it participate in that objectification? The answer is probably that it did both. Art that deals with difficult subjects often does. It can critique and perpetuate at the same time. It can make you think and also make you complicit. McQueen's work is not comfortable, and it is not meant to be. It asks you to look at things you might rather not look at, and it does not give you easy answers. But there is also joy in the work. There is wit and humor. and a sense of play. The It's a Jungle Out There collection from 1997, for example, was full of bright colors and animal prints and garments that were exuberant and wild. The Scanners collection from 2003 included dresses that were printed with medical imagery X-rays and scans, and while the concept was dark, the execution was almost giddy. McQueen had a sense of humor about himself and about fashion, and it came through in the work. He loved his family. He was especially close to his sisters and to his mother, and he made sure that his success benefited them. He bought his mother a house. He helped his siblings financially. He was loyal to the people who had been loyal to him. He was also capable of cutting people off completely if he felt betrayed or slighted. He held grudges. He was not forgiving. He was openly gay, though he was private about his personal life. He came out at a time when the fashion industry was full of gay men, but when being openly gay could still limit your career in certain ways, McQueen did not care. He was who he was. He did not hide it. He also did not make it the center of his public identity. His work was not explicitly about queerness, though you could argue that his interest in the body as a site of transformation and reinvention, his fascination with drag and performance, and the constructed nature of gender, all had queer resonances. He struggled with body image. He was heavy for much of his adult life, and he lost and gained weight repeatedly. He talked about feeling ugly, about not fitting into the fashion world's narrow standards of beauty. He made clothes that celebrated different kinds of bodies, that challenged the idea that there is only one way to be beautiful. But he also suffered from the same insecurities that plague anyone who lives in a world that values appearance above almost everything else. In his final years, he became more reclusive. He spent more time at his house in the countryside, away from London and the fashion world. He gardened. He read. He watched films. He spent time with his dogs, which he loved obsessively. He was tired. He was lonely. He was also still making collections, still putting on shows, still meeting the demands of the industry and the business. It was too much. It was always too much. There is no way to know what he would have made if he had lived. He was only 40. He could have had another 20 or 30 years of work ahead of him. He could have kept pushing, kept evolving, kept finding new ways to think about clothing and the body and beauty. Or he could have burned out, could have repeated himself, could have become a parody of his earlier work. There is no way to know. What we have is what he made, and what he made is enough. The Widows of Culloden remains, for many people, his masterpiece. It is the collection that feels most like a summation, most like a statement of everything he believed and everything he was trying to say. It is about history and loss and identity and the way that clothing can carry meaning across time. It is about Scotland and his own heritage, and the violence that was done to his ancestors. It is about mourning and memory and the way that beauty can be a form of resistance. The collection is full of tartans, that most recognizable symbol of Scottish identity, but they are used in unexpected ways, layered and draped and cut into silhouettes that are both traditional and avant-garde. There are references to Highland dress and to Victorian mourning, to military uniforms, and to romantic gowns. The colors are rich and dark reds and blacks and deep purples, with occasional flashes of white. The fabrics are luxurious velves and silks and lace. The tailoring is exquisite. Every garment is constructed with the kind of precision that McQueen learned on Savile Row, but the effect is not stiff or formal. The clothes move, they breathe. They feel alive. The show itself was staged as a kind of ritual. The space was circular, intimate. The lighting was low, with a pyramid of light in the center that drew the eye. The models walked slowly, processionally, their faces solemn. There was a sense of ceremony, of something being enacted rather than simply displayed. The soundtrack was somber and atmospheric, a mix of orchestral music and ambient sound that created a mood of elegy and longing. And the final look, that gown of layered tulle, is one of the most iconic garments McQueen ever made. It is enormous, but also somehow weightless, a structure built from layers and layers of sheer fabric that create a silhouette that is both solid and insubstantial. The bodice is fitted, severe, almost architectural, but the skirt is soft and floating, moving around the model like fog. It is a garment about absence and presence, about the way that mourning can be both heavy and light, about the way that memory is something you carry and something that carries you. The Widows of Culloden was shown in 2006, 4 years before McQueen's death. It was followed by other collections, some of them brilliant, Plato's Atlantis in particular, but none of them had quite the same weight, the same sense of completeness. It feels, looking back, like a statement, like a work that McQueen knew was important even as he was making it. It is a collection about endings, and it is fitting that it stands, in the collective memory, as one of his greatest achievements. After his death, people went looking for signs. They re-watched his shows, and reread his interviews and tried to find evidence that he had been saying goodbye all along. And there is evidence, if you look for it. The darkness was always there. The preoccupation with death was always there. The sense that beauty and destruction were inseparable was always there. But it is also true that McQueen was always preoccupied with those things, from the very beginning, and that looking for signs of his death in his work is a way of trying to make sense of something that does not make sense. He was a genius. That word gets used too easily, but in McQueen's case, it is appropriate. He had a vision and a technical ability and a willingness to take risks that set him apart from his peers. He made work that was original and challenging and beautiful and disturbing, and he did it at a level of craft that was almost unparalleled. He changed fashion. He changed the way people think about what fashion can be and what it can say. He was also a human being who suffered, who struggled, who could not find a way to live with the pain and the pressure and the darkness that he carried. His death was a tragedy. It was a loss to the people who loved him and to the world that his work inhabited. But his death is not the only thing that defines him. The work is what defines him. The work is what remains. There are young designers now who cite McQueen as an influence, who try to emulate his theatricality, or his technical skill, or his willingness to provoke. Some of them succeed. Most of them do not. It is hard to copy genius. It is hard to copy someone whose work was so deeply personal, so bound up with their own obsessions and their own pain. But the influence is there. You can see it in the way designers think about runway shows as events, as performances, as something more than just a display of clothes. You can see it in the way fashion has become more willing to engage with difficult subjects, with politics and history and identity. You can see it in the way craft and concept are no longer seen as opposites, but as two aspects of the same practice. McQueen's work is in museums now. It is in the permanent collections of the Met and the V&A and other institutions around the world. It is being studied by scholars and students. It is being preserved and catalogued and written about. This is what happens to artists after they die. Their work is removed from the context of their life and placed into the context of history. It becomes something different. It becomes legacy. But legacy is a cold word. It does not capture the heat and the urgency and the danger of McQueen's shows when they were happening, when you did not know what he was going to do next, when the work felt alive and immediate and a little bit frightening. That is what is lost when an artist dies. The work remains, but the possibility of new work, the sense that something is still unfolding, is gone. In 2015, when Savage Beauty came to London, people queued for hours to see it. They stood in line in the rain, waiting to get inside, waiting to see the clothes. It was a remarkable response, the kind of response usually reserved for blockbuster films or rock concerts, but people wanted to be in the presence of McQueen's work. They wanted to see the garments up close, to understand how they were made, to feel the atmosphere that he had created. It was a kind of pilgrimage. Inside the exhibition, you could see the evolution of his work, from the raw, confrontational early pieces to the more refined later collections. You could see the recurring motifs, the skulls and the feathers and the tartans. You could see the tailoring and the construction, the hours of work that went into each garment. You could see the imagination, the way he took an idea and pushed it as far as it could go. And you could see the darkness, the preoccupation with death and violence in the body as a site of suffering. It was all there, laid out in a series of rooms, each one designed to evoke a different aspect of his vision. The final room of the exhibition was devoted to Plato's Atlantis. The walls were covered in the reptilian prints from the collection, and the garments were displayed on platforms that made them look like specimens in a natural history museum. The armadillo shoes were there, and the dresses with the exaggerated hips and shoulders, and the sense that you were looking at something from the future or from another planet. It was a fitting end to the exhibition, a reminder that McQueen was always looking forward, always trying to imagine what came next, even when he could not imagine a future for himself. Walking out of the exhibition, you felt the weight of it. You felt the loss. You felt the enormity of what he had made and the fact that he was no longer here to make more. But you also felt gratitude. Gratitude that he had lived, that he had made the work, that it still existed to be seen and felt and thought about. There's a quote from McQueen that gets repeated often. He said, "I want to be the purveyor of a certain silhouette or a way of cutting, so that when I am dead and gone, people will know that the 21st century was started by Alexander McQueen." It is a grandiose statement, the kind of thing that could sound arrogant if it were not also true. He did start something. He did change the way fashion looks and the way it functions and the way it is thought about. His influence is everywhere, even if people do not always recognize it. But the quote also reveals something about him. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted his work to last. He wanted to leave a mark. And he did. The work is still here. It is still being looked at and worn and studied. It is still provoking and challenging and moving people. That is what matters. That is what lasts. In the end, the story of Alexander McQueen is a story about making. About the relentless, exhausting, necessary work of making things that matter, of making things that say something true, even if the truth is difficult. It is a story about craft and vision and the way that the two can come together to create something that is more than the sum of its parts. It is a story about suffering, too, about the cost of that kind of intensity, about what happens when the pressure becomes too much. But it is also, and perhaps most importantly, a story about beauty. About the way that beauty can exist alongside darkness, that it can be made from darkness, that it can be a response to violence and pain and loss. McQueen made beautiful things. He made difficult things. He made things that were both beautiful and difficult. And that is rare. That is what makes his work matter. That is what makes it last. He was from Lewisham, and he ended up in the Met. He learned to cut a jacket on Savile Row, and he used that knowledge to make garments that looked like they came from a dream or a nightmare. He was gay and working class and difficult and brilliant, and he used all of that to make work that was entirely his own. He struggled, he suffered, he made extraordinary things. And then he was gone. The clothes remain. They are in museums and in archives and in the closets of the people who bought them. They are in photographs and in videos of the shows. They are in the memory of everyone who saw them, who felt the shock and the beauty and the strangeness of what McQueen was doing. They are still speaking. They are still saying something about beauty and violence and the body and history and what it means to make art out of fabric and thread and vision. There is a photograph of McQueen from early in his career. He is young, maybe in his 20s, and he is standing in his studio in Hoxton. He is surrounded by fabric and patterns and half-finished garments. He looks tired, but also focused, his attention on the work in front of him. There is something in his expression that is both vulnerable and defiant, something that suggests he knows how hard this is going to be, and he is going to do it anyway. That is the image to hold on to. Not the tragic ending, not the myth of the tortured genius, but the young man in the studio, learning to make things, figuring out what he wants to say and how to say it. That is where the work comes from. That is where it always comes from. From the decision to show up and to make something, even when you do not know if it will work, even when you are afraid, even when the world is indifferent or hostile or simply not paying attention, McQueen showed up. He made the work. He gave everything to it, and what he made is still here, still speaking, still mattering. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything.